So I'm JP. Thanks for the intro, Max. Really nice to be here. I am going to be talking about, the speech precepts, ethical communication, particularly focusing on exploring our definition of harsh speech. Um, I think there's a lot of valid interpretations of that, and I think I hope it will be a beneficial discussion. Um, Yes, and so about the first half, I want to ground it quite a lot in the Pali Canon rather than just some guy's opinion. Um, and then after that, I'll try and speak more from the heart. Um, but yes, I'm used to speaking from the heart quite a lot. I can be a rambler. Um, but this time, I've actually tried planning quite a lot. So please excuse me, I'm going to be looking at a laptop a little bit. That Max has very nicely brought this table, so it's not in between us at all. So I'd also like to acknowledge country. We're on the land of the Gadigal clan, of the Eora Nation, or broader Darug Nation, depending on historical understanding if they speak the same language. So pay my respects to their traditions, past, present, and into the future. And I'd also like to acknowledge the huge amount of practice that's gone on in this room and the huge amount of community and efforts that have flowed into and continue to flow into this space and this centre, this broader community. And of course, there's lots of rich traditions in the world, First Nations in Australia and the Buddhist tradition, and lots and lots of others too. So respect to all of that. I'd also like to acknowledge that this topic is a bit difficult for me. I have mixed motivations, mixed intentions. I bring helpful mind states and I bring frustrated mind states as well. So I think that's a really good thing to acknowledge for myself as a speaker in deciding whether to do the talk. And that's very much on the topics that we're going to be covering. And I decided that I think it's helpful to just be really transparent and vulnerable about that. I'm an imperfect person trying to do my best. So thanks. Yeah, so great. If someone could keep me on time, I was hoping to set up a really big clock. But I forgot it is my number one weak spot. But if you could just, oh yeah, nice, perfect. And we are due to finish at?
You've got roughly 20 minutes.
From now, great. So 10:50 is okay. We'll be fine, I say. Okay. No, this is good. Thanks, Max. Okay. So I'd like to start off by talking about, I was really interested around harsh speech recently because I was speaking a bit harshly, but I think some people thought I was speaking more harshly than I was. And so I really wanted to look into really inform my sense of that for my own reflections. And I went into looking at how the Buddha spoke. Of course, we're not the Buddha; we have very different minds and challenges from the Buddha, but it's still relevant. And as you'll see later, he gives very similar teachings for his disciples as well. So, how did the Buddha speak? So the Buddha was a loving person. Ananda, his companion and attendant and cousin for most of his life, spent most days with the Buddha for, I don't know, 30 years or something. When the Buddha died, he sort of summed the Buddha up as he who was so kind. So this is a really important quality of the Buddha, and I think it's one of the ones that we're the most familiar with. And I want to bring that up at the beginning because I'm going to be exploring some other sides of the Buddha, but I really don't want to detract from a firm foundation in the Buddha as kind. A bit like for the people in the room, you can see there's the different jinas on the wall. I'm going to take liberty to assume that Jinavadra's name refers to Akshobhya. Yep. Blue over on the. So there's this different kind of archetypal Buddhas, and then they're supposed to be different facets of the historical Buddha. So, receptivity and kindness, skillful action, teaching. These are a bit simplified, but I think they're on the mark. Renunciation and the kind of joy and energy and contentment that comes from renunciation, and also wisdom and quite an active power. So the Vajra group of Buddhist figures, so like diamond thunderbolts, lightning bolts. So there is also this, there's a lot of balanced qualities in, that are cherished and practiced in Buddhism, and also that are seen in the life of the historical Buddha and brought out for us through teaching tools and devotional practices like the jinas. So I guess what I'm going to be trying to do in talking about harsh speech is exploring some of that difficult territory about when is it okay to have conflict in conversation. It's an important topic, and one that can be complex and have a lot of valid feelings around. Great. So the Buddha was very kind, despite some of the things I might say. The Buddha was he's from the Majjhima Nikaya, a description of the Buddha teaching. So when he is teaching Dharma to an assembly in a park, he does not exalt them or disparage them, but rather he delights, uplifts, inspires, and gladdens them with talk on Dharma. So I think this is much more representative of how the Buddha spoke, and there's so many examples of that in the scriptures, in the Pali Canon, in the recordings of the Buddha's life and teachings. But there's also other times when the Buddha was quite critical, often of different beliefs or practices that he felt misled people, and was concerned for the welfare of people doing these practices or being influenced by these practices, and also sometimes concerned for protecting a clear understanding of the Dharma as well. So here's, I wish I hadn't deleted there's a really harsh one about Jainism actually, which is interesting. But I took it out because I couldn't find, it was referenced where I found it on the internet, but when I went, I've been quite thorough to make sure I'm speaking the truth as best as I can. And so I really went into English translations of the Pali scriptures to check those references. And that one, the reference was to a completely different sutta. So I decided to maybe, and would have been quite controversial as well. So I decided to skip it. But yeah, I've been quite shocked at some of the really strong language used sometimes. But I'll stick to things that are sort of more verified. So when I wasn't trying to find that, I did find another one, also from the Majjhima Nikaya, which is the collection of middle-length discourses. And this one is called at Devadaha, or the Devadaha Sutta. So, and the translation is by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, who's a well-respected translator. I'm not reading the translation though. So to sum it up, this is very long. The Buddha describes his own discussions with the Niganthas, who are like an aesthetic group, who believe that, suffering now came from bad karma from the past, and that self-imposed suffering through sometimes quite harsh ascetic practices kind of burnt up the old karma, and that essentially, self-imposed suffering now would free them from suffering in the future. So you can understand someone being quite concerned for the welfare there. And the Buddha, it's very long, it's the Buddha describing to his disciples his own arguments with this movement. And the Buddha is describing a very long, not angry, it's calm, but it's very straight talking, often very blunt, rigorous and very detailed and very long total demolition of all their core beliefs to them, in person. And they're not, falling on their knees being like, now we're all converted, yay, there's lots of also stories of, there's another story I read of just an average guy, a Shakyan from the historical Buddha's own clan, before he renounced for the homely life, who comes up to the Buddha and just doesn't like the teachings and goes off kind of muttering and debating them. And there were people that were even trying to kill the Buddha. There was so this is David Data, what's his name? I took that out, didn't I? So what was the Buddha's cousin who was trying to kill him a couple of times? David Data, thank you. So David Data was the Buddha's cousin who tried to kill him a couple of times. And this was actually largely because of dharmic disagreements. He was once again also a preacher of harsher ascetic practices, and actually within the Buddhist community as well. And there was he sort of tried to divide and even asked the Buddha to retire and let him take over teaching the whole sangha for a while. And at one stage the Buddha says to him, I don't even let Sariputra and Mogdaliana take over the sangha. Why would I, the likes of you? You are like spittle to be vomited. Yeah. So, this is someone that later tried to kill him twice. This is prior to. But the Buddha's reprimands and rebukes were never to hurt. They were to spur people to make more efforts, to re-examine their actions or beliefs, or protect people from bad influence and protect the Dharma. The Buddha was also frequently criticized and debated with himself. He would usually remain calm, correct any misunderstandings, and usually clearly outline what he taught and what he didn't teach. Sometimes people would even have a lot of abuse and insult the Buddha because his beliefs were contrary to theirs. For example, the Buddha doesn't believe in an eternal soul, or that salvation comes from a God on high. It's from your own efforts here and now. Some people really don't like that idea. So you can imagine he was a very controversial figure. He also ordained people from all castes, women. Anyone who could make effort could do his practices, and that was radical for the cultural context of the time. So sometimes the Buddha was not criticized but rather abused with rude or harsh words. At such times he usually remained silent and maintained a dignified silence. In the Sutta to Prince Abhiya, which is also in the Majjhima Nikaya, 58, and this is translated also by Thanissaro Bhikkhu. So the Buddha describes his own considerations on whether he would say something or not. When would the Buddha talk? And when would he stay silent? So when was his speech ethical? When was his speech an ethical action as opposed to an unethical action? So in this sutta, he describes his own checklist, a 6-stage checklist. I'm not going to read through the whole thing because it's very repetitive, but you'll get a good sense. So this is the Buddha's description of his own process. He says, in the case of words that the Tathagata, which is a name for the Buddha, which means thus gone. So in the case of words that Tathagata knows to be unfactual, untrue, unbeneficial, unendearing, and disagreeable to others, he does not say that. Makes sense, right? What's the point? And it's going to piss everyone off. So the third one is in the case of words that Tathagata knows to be factual, true, and beneficial, but unendearing and disagreeable to others. He has a sense of the proper time for saying them, so he does speak. The fifth one, in the case of words that the Tathagata knows to be factual, true, unbeneficial, but endearing and agreeable to others, he does not say them. I guess sometimes I have come up as a bit of a straight talker with frustration that sometimes there seems to be more emphasis on maintaining an agreeable cordiality than saying something that you think might be helpful or to correct someone. And obviously it's a struggle to, obviously we want it to be a nice experience for everyone to be close. This is very important still. But I guess I'm having a bit of a check-in with what's the most important and also what is a total no-no. How do we define harsh speech? Is it based on if someone's offended or is it based on our intent? So, but how did the Buddha ask us to speak? So this is once again from the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle-length discourses from 103, in English called What Do You Think About Me? Which is the first line after the standard intro. That's how they're named. And it's called in Pali the Kiniti Sutta. So this is a translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi, also a very accepted, respected translator. So this is a great sutta actually, and I was tempted to read it out, but it's very repetitive and it would be dry as hell and really not a SBC talk style. But if you're interested in looking it up, yes, the Majjhima Nikaya 103 Kiniti Sutta, I'd highly recommend, as it is instructions to monks for how to communicate with each other in a large range of situations, including when someone's done something they think is wrong, when two people have different understandings of the Dharma, when groups within the Sangha have different understandings of the Dharma, and it sets out his recommended proceedings through that, and they're very reasonable. So this is one excerpt. Yeah. So then it may occur to you, bhikkhus, I shall be troubled and the other person will be hurt, for the other person is given to anger and resentment, and he is firmly attached to his view and he relinquishes with difficulty. Yet I can make that person emerge from the unwholesome and establish him in the wholesome. It is a mere trifle that I shall be troubled and the other person hurt, but it is a much greater thing that I can make that person emerge from the unwholesome and establish him in the wholesome. If such occurs to you, bhikkhus, it is proper to speak. So you can't get much clearer than that. And it's the Buddha's, it's like the best records we have of the Buddha's words, giving a completely in context relevant instruction utterly on the topic. It is for ordained to ordained, and that's also like ordained not in a sort of lay order like us, where I think it's also completely relevant. I personally think it's relevant for everyone as well. But that is a contextual difference, I guess, where it's like quite renounced, so non-householders, quite like worldly renounced Dharma practitioners. So perhaps the Buddha may have given different instructions to householders in this. I'm not sure on that. But still, we're pretty close to the mark with very clear instructions on this topic. So, I've gone a little over with that bit, but now I'd like to, and partly that's good because I have been speaking more from the heart as I've gone, which I'm glad about. So, what are our challenges with ethical speech? So a big one is knowing if what we're saying really is true, if it really is helpful, and if it is timely. Some of these things might even be, it might seem timely to us or our cultural understandings, but not to the person we're talking to. We could completely, and I think most people can get stuck in a bunch of righteous indignation and think that what we're saying is very true and it must be helpful. So this is a real challenge. This is bringing me back to what I was talking about at the beginning of knowing our mixed intentions and trying to be honest and work with them. We're not free from greed, hatred, and delusion like the Buddha was. It's a very key difference. And it's also I think quite safely proposed, the heart of Buddhism, or as your job as your aspiration as a Buddhist practitioner is to free yourself from greed, hatred, and delusion, little by little. And you're bringing that into the world as well, and also to help free other beings from the suffering of greed, hatred, and delusion. So it's a very important thing to remember. It's what we're working on, not what we can already do. So there's questions like, are we starting fights for fun? Do we just want to feel right, empowered? Are we trying to take out frustrations on others, which is something I was really checked in on before doing this talk, and have done a lot of processing. And actually, Suede, I've made a point of remembering your name because I'm bringing you up again. I hope that's okay. I really enjoyed your talk, as I said, and Suede's body awareness. So her talk was on chilling like a villain, so relaxed but alert. So is our body, she talked about using our body as a tell or a kind of compass for our mental state. So, is our body relaxed? Is our heart open? These can be easier things to get a sense of than, is our swirling self-righteous mind correct? Of course, So, and if we're not sure, we can always hold our tongue. Or usually we can hold our tongue and come back to it later. We can sleep on it. We can sort out our own emotions and charge around it and come to a place of peace in ourselves first before preferably connecting with the person. And then sometimes it is helpful and kind to correct the person. Even if it turns out we're wrong, then we'll get the correction. So we get to gain even more, which is great. I've had that happen, and that's good. Another challenge I think we have is cultural. So I think Australians are a little bit, not as much as the British, but we're much more over that side. I tend to get along really well with like Germans and Dutch, Americans who are a bit more straight talking to. But yeah, we have this British-derived culture that's not very comfortable with conflict or talking straight. Prefer sort of, just diplomacy and cups of tea, or we probably also socially respect some underhanded weasel words than just someone straight calling something out. You might disgrace yourself by calling someone out especially in a public setting. So, and that's understandable because sometimes that is ungraceful and could have been done much more timely, kind of one-on-one time with the person and not embarrass them. So there's a lot of goodness to that, but it's also very nuanced, and we bring a lot of cultural understanding to what we do. And different cultures see this very differently and practice it very differently day to day. I think there's also a growing belief, that if we're offended, it's somebody else's fault. And that if we've offended someone, we are bad or must have been harsh. And sometimes that's true. There's lots of offensive stuff, hate speech, these kind of words that are really useful conversations to have because people are just hurting people. I'm not condoning that, and this talk is never intended, and I think I've made it pretty clear, kindness is still really important, to give an excuse to that kind of behavior. But also, especially in Buddhism, and I think also just in common practicality, we have to take responsibility for our own mind states. We can't control the world, but we can control our response to it. Somewhat. At least we're trying to get better at it, right? So another thing I think is groups. So no one likes a know-it-all, and most people avoid conflict and protect the views, people, symbols, and groups that give us protection, because we're all vulnerable and we're all going for refuge. Here in this room, we're going for refuge to things that we believe can really help our suffering. But we also very naturally and very humanly, I do it to all sorts of things, seek refuge from suffering in lots of things that are kind of dead ends. They can be very helpful. They're not necessarily bad at all. Like friendship and companionship is great, and that can actually go really, really far away, all the way. It's always good. But just feeling safe because you've got friends and you kind of cling together in this suffering world and kind of keep each other the same. That's not really transformative, right? And like I'm saying, this is mixed intentions, mixed dynamics. I'm giving very almost hyperbolic examples to make a clear point, but I hope you understand. Yeah, and so personally, I felt often I've cried in pujas. Once I was told this Mahayana text is incomprehensible. UK order member was reading out, let it wash all over you, and then at the end I said, oh, isn't it just about this? And I was actually really timid because I felt like I was confused why my experience was different from everyone else's. And everyone laughed. And I was very confused when I asked the order member afterwards, what happened? I'm so confused. I don't, why? That was my genuine experience. It doesn't have to be right, but I went, am I wrong? And he said, oh, I read the wrong bit. And probably everyone was in awe of this guy and just heard it the way they thought or something. I don't know. And I've seriously so many situations like that. And we went up to puja afterwards. It was at a retreat, and I cried all the way through the puja. Because I also take skillful but not ultimately true refuge in sangha and belonging. And that can be really hard. So yeah. We're all human, and I'm sorry if I've hurt people from being too straight talking and harsh, but it's a complicated matter being human together in this journey. So I'm about to wrap up. What are the things that can support us through these challenges and help us navigate this turns out even richer and more nuanced and more challenging challenge of ethical communication? So there's the three jewels. So we've got the Buddha, and for some people it might be really, really helpful to focus on just a calm, serene Buddha. That might be a perfect balancing quality for them, and it's certainly really quite safe. We also have an amazingly well recorded life of the historical Buddha, and amazing teaching tools that enrich the aspects of the Buddha and paint that picture of different balancing qualities. We have the Dharma, so both the written Dharma and also, well, it is from the written Dharma, things like the precepts. So in the front shrine room, we chanted the 5 precepts this morning, and there'll be plenty of people in the room that are taking the 10 precepts, which are like an expansion of the same ones. So and very much like what I talked about. So the 4th precept in 5 is truthful communication. In the 10, it expands to, much like these lists and probably sourced from similar stuff in the Pali Canon, truthful, kindly, helpful, harmonious. So using these, and if we're unclear on what that word might be, in the positive sense, I think they're always quite safe, but in the I abstain from harsh speech, for example, that's a really clear training principle we're taking on. It's good to understand, what does harsh speech mean? How's it defined? How do you measure how harsh it is? Is it how offended someone got? Is it more complicated than that? We have, of course, the centrality of intention in Buddhist practices, and in understanding that goal of transformation away from the suffering that our own delusion, greed, and hatred cause, and further towards awareness, contentment, and kindness. And so that context, I think, is really important to understand all Buddhist ethics, not just ethics of communication, but all ethics. That's why they are an active transformational process, because they are our intentions, our mind states flowing through our acts of body, speech, and mind itself. We also have sangha and friends, and this is what I'll be finishing on. So we have each other to hold each other up, to keep each other in better mind states, to be not because it's not a ordained, not an ordained, it's not an enlightened sangha. It's a skillful, unenlightened sangha is a very skillful but not ultimate refuge, because we're still human. We can still mislead each other. We can still hurt each other. But it's a beautiful thing. It's one of the most beautiful things in the world. And especially if we can be honest with each other and talk to each other, we can give each other feedback as best we can and keep each other on the path. And sometimes that might mean a little nudge left or a little nudge right for different people in different contexts. And I think as long as we can all listen to each other, and the more people we listen to, with respect to their experience and the validity of what they say, and the intention of what they say, I think we'll be much better placed to support each other as fellow practitioners in our transformation. So thank you very much, and thank you for listening.